What's happening, y'all? Welcome inside the Fantasy Stock Exchange. Danny and Bush coming at you with week 2 of our August ranking series. We're coming at you with tight ends 1 through 8 today. Tomorrow, we're going to do tight ends 9 to 16, and then we'll get into running backs next week and wide receivers the week after. So you guys know the drill. We're officially in August. This is prime draft season. We have 2 preseason games on tonight. We have, I believe it's the Washington football team and the Patriots, I think, that is playing. And
Steelers, Eagles, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So we got a couple preseason games today. Don't worry, I'll have you covered on Monday talking about all the ramifications from the preseason games, usages, first team, all that kind of stuff. But today we're talking about tight ends. We're talking about our top 8 tight ends to be specific. So if you guys enjoyed this video at any point, you feel like you got some value from it, hit the like button. It helps us out tremendously. Comment any of your thoughts down below. What tight end are you targeting, for example, at ADP this year? Subscribe to the channel if you are new. Danny, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. And yeah, subscribe to the channel if you are new, on the road to 5,000 as always. And yeah, I'm excited. We're going to be talking some tight ends, talking about the top ballers at the position, numbers 1 to 8. And yeah, ready to get to work and ready to get started with this.
Awesome. So we're going to hit the intro and then we're going to get into the first tight end. So you guys should be able to see our consensus top 8 tight ends on the screen. And you can see we kind of agree a lot on this top 8 because the only difference in our rankings is actually our ranking of Mark Andrews and TJ Hockenson. The rest of our rankings are the exact same, pretty much. It's outside of the tiers of the top 3 guys. So, I mean, this is pretty typical at the tight end position. We kind of all know who the top end guys are. So what we're going to do in this video basically is talk about where we're comfortable drafting these guys as opposed to breaking down the players entirely. We will, of course, break down the players, but we're going to focus a lot more on where we're going to draft these guys because I think that's the more tangible thing for you guys to take away from this video is where you should take Travis Kelce or where you should take Darren Waller in relation to the other positions. So we're going to start with our tight end 1. Of course, it is Travis Kelce. It should be nobody other than Travis Kelce, in my opinion. So we're going to go over their underdog ADP and also their aggregate ADP from sites like NFL.com, Yahoo, FFPC, and things of that nature. So currently going off the board, underdog ADP tight end 1, 6.5 overall, so about 7th overall in drafts, 5th overall in home league ADP. So Travis Kelce actually going a little earlier for the novice players as opposed to the experts, which is not something we usually see. Obviously, with Travis Kelce, this is a guy who's been tight end 1 every year since 2016, coming off of a historic season where he's still tethered to the best right arm in football in Patrick Mahomes. He's gotten 136 plus targets for the past 3 years and is coming off a season where he broke the tight end receiving yards record and had 11 touchdowns in only 15 games played. Same thing we said for Tyreek Hill last, in June when we talked about the wide receiver rankings. We can easily project Travis Kelce's volume because of the situation he's in. We can easily project a guy for 8+ touchdowns because of the quarterback he has. We can easily project the guy for 130, 140 targets because he is the driving force of that offense, even though Tyreek contributes to a good degree. And when you look at his landscape of the overall tight ends, this is a guy that is the epitome of good volume, right? He has an elite quarterback throwing him the ball. He's top 5 in deep targets. He was top 2 in red zone targets last year. Everything you want out of a tight end is what Travis Kelce is. So with that being said, where are you comfortable taking Travis Kelce in your drafts?
For sure. And when you're looking at Travis Kelce, I'm going to quickly mention, out of the whole first round, apart from maybe Christian McCaffrey, like, can you make an argument that anybody in that round is safer? Because when I'm looking at Travis Kelce, I say, okay, listen, if this guy's playing the whole season, he's, in my opinion, a near lock to finish as the tight end 1. He's got the volume. He's got the touchdown upside. He's got the offensive upside. In terms of where I would take him in drafts, he's currently my 7th ranked player, more in line with where ADP is on him, 6.5. I am at 7. I know you personally, you just don't really like taking tight ends at the top. Where would you personally take him?
I have Travis Kelce at 16. And like you said, this is no slight to Travis Kelce as a player. You're right. He definitely is one of the safer players in the first couple rounds. And he is a huge advantage at the tight end position. It's the reason we see every year when we see percentage of players on playoff rosters, it's always why Travis Kelce ranks highest is because he doesn't bust. It's basically his MO as a tight end. So I have him at 16. I know that's probably lower than he's going to finish in terms of overall value as a fantasy player. But to me, I can't pass up the opportunity for these, legendary upside running backs like a Najee Harris, like a Antonio Gibson, like a Jonathan Taylor near the back end of the first round. So I would rather take those running backs because I think the elite opportunity is more scarce. And yes, there is probably a greater argument that you can make that no tight end has the same upside that Travis Kelce does. But if it was a 2 tight end league, a tight end premium, then it's a different conversation. But in a single normal onesie position tight end league, the running back upside, in my opinion, is more important. And that's why I lean taking running back and some of these wide receivers too, Diggs and Tyreek, over a guy like Travis Kelce. But I do agree he probably is worth where you would select him. I just personally wouldn't pass on some of those running backs.
Yeah, and that's definitely fair. I mean, currently for me, the only 6 overall players I would take ahead of him would be McCaffrey, Cook, Kamara, Zeke, and both the Packers right now. Obviously, if Saquon, we hear more good reports about him, I can move him up to that range as well. But when I just look at Travis Kelce, I'm like, man, from a structural standpoint, you get that absolute anchor at the position, tight end position. Although it's the more not the most scarce position, it is a position that is very flooded at the top. I mean, we see Travis Kelce year in and year out absolutely pretty much shit on the rest of the competition, in all honesty. I mean, as good and as much as I like the next couple guys we're going to mention, I mean, Travis Kelce is just in a tier of his own for a reason. I mean, when you're talking about a guy that can legitimately give you top 5 wide receiver production at a tight end position, where you're seeing guys ranked a tight end 6, tight end 7 every year with like 700 yards and 6 touchdowns, it just makes me more comfortable with taking a guy at the top. But again, I understand it's fully personal preference. I just personally would be able to take him that mid first.
Right. Yeah. And I would say anytime he's in the second round, like if you're on the board and he's not your first pick in your draft, if you're picking at the 12 pick, for example, and he's still on the board and you want to go with a workhorse type running back like Jonathan Taylor and you want to take Travis Kelce in round 2 at round 2-1 or whatever, I definitely think that's a viable strategy. I just personally can't spend my first pick on a tight end. That's just a personal thing of mine. Totally, personal preference. If you are willing to take him, I think the earliest you could take Travis Kelce is about where he's going. The 7th overall player kind of sounds right to me. So with that being said, we're going to move on to Darren Waller, who is our second rated tight end, currently going off the board in Underdog drafts at tight end 2, 22 overall, tight end 3, 25 overall in terms of more home league ADP. So in my opinion, the way I look at Darren Waller is basically that he's the Devontae Adams of tight ends. And the reason I say that is because he has such a stranglehold on the volume in his offense that it reminds me of the Adams situation in Green Bay. He gets so much volume that it's pretty much hard not to rank him over George Kittle, in my opinion, because George Kittle simply has more target competition, and the volume that he's going to get is probably, like, as much as people want to shit on Derek Carr, he's an accurate quarterback when throwing to Darren Waller in that area of the field. So he has exactly the type of quarterback that can help him flourish. And speaking of his opportunity, just look at this on the screen right now.
Yeah.
Number 1 in target share last year, 28% target share at the tight end position is unheard of. 33% target share inside the red zone, 146 targets overall. Number 1 in deep targets, number 1 in red zone targets, number 4 in hog rate, number 3 in air yard share of his offense. This is a guy that dominates the Raiders' targets.
Yeah, no, I mean, when you're talking about Darren Waller, we always like going through the quote-unquote narrative in fantasy, volume is king. Well, in this situation, yeah, maybe Derek Carr's not the best fantasy football quarterback, but in terms of a real-life quarterback, this is an accurate quarterback that feeds the ball to his athletic freak of a tight end. When you're talking about Darren Waller, I mentioned him with Travis Kelce. He has the upside on any given week to win you the week. Darren Waller's got that at the tight end position. I mean, 146 targets for a tight end is just absolutely freaking ludicrous. And I'm sure a lot of you who owned him down the stretch last year can reason with the fact that this guy's absolutely worth that top pick that you're currently spending on him. I mean, this is a guy down the stretch in 2020 legitimately was winning leagues. I mean, we're looking at his last 5 games. Keep this in mind. Last 5 games, talking about PPR format. 45, 14.5, 30, 16.2, 25.7. Not only is that elite tight end or production from the tight end position, that would be elite league winning wide receiver production.
Or that would honestly be elite running back numbers too.
Easily.
Like that's the crazy thing about Darren Waller. And again, I made the argument that I don't like taking, tight ends over workhorse running backs, but Darren Waller falls in a point in the draft where those workhorse running backs tend to dry up a bit. And you're choosing Darren Waller over guys like, for example, who I have him rated around. You're choosing him between J.K. Dobbins and DeAndre Swift, who aren't necessarily workhorse running backs. You're not taking Darren Waller over Najee Harris, Antonio Gibson, Jonathan Taylor types. You're taking him more so over the more questionable running back options that we have in terms of their volume. And in my opinion, this should keep up this year, right? Like Darren Waller, it was great what he did last year. I think this should be more of the same because Aguilar was his biggest competition for targets. Aguilar is now gone. The only way he doesn't absolutely dominate this offense again is if these young guys take massive steps forward. I mean, Henry Ruggs and Bryan Edwards, they would have to take huge steps for him to not dominate that. And even still, I still think this is a 25% target share guy at minimum. And that's with Edwards probably being an 800-yard receiver, a Ruggs being a 900-yard receiver. I still think in that situation, which I don't think is likely, that Waller's still a 25% target share guy.
And while us personally here at FSC is more optimistic on Ruggs because we do believe the player has a ton of talent, and myself included with Edwards too. I thought Edwards was a good prospect coming out. At the same time here, betting on those guys completely outproducing, completely smashing what they did last year is quite literally a bet against math, because we've seen multiple times over the years the statistics of face planners in their second years. Isn't that great, man?
And face planners, for those of you who are new, are rookie wide receivers that have a ton of opportunity in front of them, basically, and they face plant. They don't do anything with the opportunity, and therefore they lose ADP in terms of dynasty startups. About 10, I think it's 10 wide receiver spots from their rookie season to their sophomore season. So that's basically what a face planner is, just for those of you that weren't sure. DF Bean Counter on Twitter is the one who kind of coined the term. And I really like it because, like Danny said, the math is very predictive, basically saying that these guys are not likely to be bounce back candidates in their sophomore year because they should have basically done it as rookies. So that's basically the whole argument on Darren Waller. Again, I would take this guy as early as the late second round. That's about the apex I'm willing to take him, though. I wouldn't pick him early in the second, mid-second. I think the late second round is about the earliest I would take him. Preferably, I would prefer to get him in the third, though.
I currently have him as my 18th overall player, so I would be comfortable spending a mid-second round pick on him.
I have him as 25th overall player, so that's about the late second round, early third round. That's if you're picking first overall, and I think this is the perfect example of this. If you're picking first overall and you can get Christian McCaffrey, and on the way back you can pair maybe DeAndre Swift, maybe you get an elite wide receiver like AJ Brown, and you can grab Darren Waller as well. That's a great start to your draft, right? You're getting guys that legitimately all have potential to finish number one at their position. And I think that's a great way to start your draft. So if you're wondering if you have the first pick in your draft, maybe you know your draft position already, would you spend the turn pick on Darren Waller? I absolutely would.
Absolutely. Yeah. No. And speaking of tight end, speaking of elite athletes at the tight end position, I feel like we can get off Darren Waller and go on to the next guy on our list. And in my opinion, this is the most talented tight end in the league. Now, real life talent, as we've gone over multiple times on the channel, real life talent doesn't exactly equate straight to fantasy points, because let's be honest here, Travis Kelce is going to have a stranglehold on the position. But as good as Travis Kelce is, I do think in real life, if I were to take one tight end to play a football game for me, it would be George Kittle. And let's not forget just how good at football this guy is. I mean, this is a guy stepping in since his second year, has averaged over 75 yards per game, despite dealing with multiple injuries over that stretch. And we've seen Kittle operating in an offense led by Jimmy Garoppolo these past few seasons, and we still saw him produce like an absolute madman. Now, as you guys have known by now, we are absolutely high on Trey Lance. We think this guy is the second coming of the quarterback position. We think this guy within the next few years could be widely regarded as a top 10 overall player at the quarterback position. And in terms of pure arm strength, in terms of pure accuracy, in terms of pure mechanics, I do think that Trey Lance is a significant upgrade, even year one, over what we've seen from Jimmy Garoppolo. And if he can be a Justin Herbert, Kyler Murray-esque level quarterback for George Kittle, I mean, we've seen what George Kittle is able to do. You guys see that on the screen, 1,377, 1,053, 634 last year in 8 games. If he can add a touchdown element to his game, we could legitimately be talking about the next Travis Kelce, the next Rob Gronkowski level of dominance at the tight end position, because the skill set, the talent is all there for George Kittle to be able to capture it. It's just really a question mark in terms of how he's going to acclimate in this offense with Trey Lance and with those other wide receivers. And because of those other wide receivers on the team, mentioning Brandon Ayuk and Deebo Samuel, we mentioned with Darren Waller, he has legitimately no competition at the wide receiver position whatsoever. I mean, as much as we like Edwards and Ruggs, like cool, they're fine ancillary.
They haven't shown what Ayuk and Debo have shown in their time in the NFL.
So that's the only real question mark I have. He's not going to equal the target output of a Darren Waller, but in terms of pure talent, in terms of pure efficiency, it would be ludicrous not to have George Kittle in that 2-3 turn range where I currently have him, in my opinion.
Right. And I have him quite a bit lower than you do. So I have Darren Waller at 25. I have George Kittle at 30 overall. So I need to get George Kittle in about the mid third round for me to feel comfortable taking him, because there is a number of wide receivers, CeeDee Lamb, Terry McLaurin, some running backs as well, like J.K. Dobbins, that I would take over George Kittle. And it's all for basically the same reasons that you outlined. The fact that he does have target competition. Even if Trey Lance starts, we know that Trey Lance is more of a mobile quarterback. So the passing volume of the offense might go down a bit. But nonetheless, I'm not betting against George Kittle. I think that is a losing bet. Anybody that puts George Kittle on a bust list is ludicrous, because even if this guy gets 100 targets this year, which there's no way he gets that low of a target total. I think his lowest targets he's probably going to see this year is 110, 120.
Yeah.
If he gets 100 targets this year, this is still a top 3 tight end, because he's simply that good. That's really all it comes down to. He has the big play upside. He doesn't really have the touchdown upside, but if Trey Lance can be, ceiling projection for George Kittle, if Trey Lance comes in and plays like Justin Herbert played last year, then this guy could easily finish as the tight end 1.
And it's funny you mentioned 100 targets as a baseline. Like even if he unforeseen sees 100 targets, we saw in 2019 in a hamper season, he only played 14 games. Keep that in mind. On 107 targets, he was still an 85 reception, 1,053 yard and 5 touchdown tight end. And I'm sure you guys remember if you had George Kittle over that stretch. I swear, I don't know what it is. He is the one tight end in fantasy football that legitimately gets the most touchdowns called back I may have ever seen. It's actually insane. Like over those 2 years in 2018 and 2019, I swear this guy legitimately had like 7-8 touchdowns called back in those 2 years combined. It's just insane.
Yeah, I totally agree. So yeah, like we said, George Kittle, if you're on the board in the early third round, mid third round, I think he's a smash pick there. And then again, if you get him any later than that, then obviously that's a huge value. And same goes for Darren Waller as well. So let's get off the elite guys and let's talk about the case. We're going to have to make a little bit more cases for these guys because they're not the elite guys that have finished as elite options before. But if you're asking me who can fit into this conversation this time next year, the answer's got to be Kyle Pitts. And the reason is because if you guys are maybe new to fantasy football, maybe you're just coming back from last year. If you don't know who Kyle Pitts is, Kyle Pitts was the 4th overall pick in the 2021 NFL draft. He's currently going off the board as the tight end 4 on Underdog drafts, 46th overall. So a late third round pick, I guess, or late 4th round pick that would be. And tight end 4, 44 overall in terms of home league ADP. So about the same range in both kind of drafts. This is a generational tight end prospect. I'm not saying generational as a word to just throw around. If Saquon Barkley is a generational running back prospect when he came out, this is the Saquon Barkley of tight ends, basically. Because this is a 99th percentile athlete that not only was a great athlete, production was absolutely off the charts, right? And we saw 4th overall draft capital, similar to Saquon Barkley's 2nd overall draft capital the year that he came out. With Julio Jones gone now in Atlanta, there is a huge void in that offense for targets. Russell Gage, Olamide Zaccheaus, these guys are not filling that void. Calvin Ridley cannot do everything in that offense. And Kyle Pitts is really the polar clone of Julio Jones, except he has a TE beside his name, except for WR. Like, this is legitimately a big wide receiver. And when you look at a schematic standpoint, this is a perfect fit for his skill set because Arthur Smith comes in as the new play caller. And Arthur Smith, coming from Tennessee, who is the offensive coordinator there, basically just orchestrated the most efficient offense over the past 2 years in Tennessee and resurrected Ryan Tannehill's career, basically, because Ryan Tannehill was a cast-off from Miami, came into Arthur Smith's system and was phenomenal. Now, I think Ryan Tannehill had something to do with that, but obviously Arthur Smith should do wonders for Matt Ryan and his efficiency because with Atlanta's offense, we've seen them be a very high-volume offense in the past, but the efficiency has not necessarily been there, and I think Arthur Smith can help with that with his play calling, with his scheme. So the usage of Kyle Pitts is what's really exciting. Last year, we saw a guy in Anthony Firkser, who was the 2nd tight end on the Tennessee Titans. He led all tight ends in snaps from the slot. He was over 80% of the time in the slot in Arthur Smith's system, and we already saw Kyle Pitts deployed this way at Florida in college. He was used out wide, in the slot, in the backfield sometimes. He was used all over the formation because he's simply that good and that talented. And when we look at Jonnu Smith, who was the 1st string tight end in Tennessee last year, he ranked top 5 in red zone targets last year, despite being a part-time player, I might add. And Firkser added another 7 targets on top of his 18 in the red zone. I think Kyle Pitts is basically Jonnu Smith on steroids. You guys know how high we were on Jonnu Smith last year. He's definitely a risk, I would say, because he is a rookie tight end. Historically, rookie tight ends have not performed. But historically, and I will say this point every time I talk about this guy, historically, rookie tight ends have not been Kyle Pitts also because this is a freak of nature. This is a generational prospect. We will probably not see another tight end prospect like this for the next 10, 15 years.
Maybe 20, honestly. Like, that's how good we're talking with Kyle Pitts. He's got the athletic profile, he's got the overall production in college, and he's got the absolute draft capital. And we've already heard multiple reports this offseason. He's going to be used in the capacity as that true difference-making weapon on the outside. In terms of where would you take him, I personally have him ranked as my 43rd overall player. I'm comfortable with taking him at the back end of the 4th round. How about you, Corey?
Okay, so here's a question I have for you, because I have him ranked at 50. And I have another player that went right behind him in the draft, ranked at 51. So who would you take if you're on the board? Let's say your team situation is kind of neutral. You went kind of in a balanced approach early. Would you take Jamar Chase or would you take Kyle Pitts if you're on the board?
I have them ranked back to back right now. I currently have, I said 43. I have Kyle Pitts at 42 and Jamar Chase at 43. So right. I would personally.
Okay, so you have them back to back as well. See, I have them about 8 spots lower, both of them, than you do. So I personally would lean Kyle Pitts because I think we already talked about the Bengals situation already. I don't want to get into that again, but basically I think Kyle Pitts, because of the ability he has to be an advantage at his position, I will take Kyle Pitts over Jamar Chase because I think best case scenario for Jamar Chase, we're still talking about a guy that's probably a top 8 receiver, top 10 receiver at most. I don't think he can be a top 5 guy. So that's why I would take Kyle Pitts, because I think Kyle Pitts legitimately, as a rookie, has a chance to be a top 3 tight end this year. Yep. So that's the type of ceiling we see for Kyle Pitts. Again, if you're on the board, I would really just say make a hard line in the sand. I'm not going to take Kyle Pitts over these running backs, these wide receivers, potentially these quarterbacks as well, if you really like those second-tier guys. That's really the way I look at Kyle Pitts, because if I'm on the board and I have to pick Kyle Pitts over some guys like Amari Cooper or Chris Godwin, I'm simply not going to do it. But if I'm on the board and I have Kyle Pitts and Jerry Jeudy, or Kyle Pitts and Jamar Chase, Kyle Pitts and Robert Woods staring me in the face, I will take Kyle Pitts there because I think the ceiling is worthy of that reach. And again, we say this on numerous occasions. I'm trying to win my league, and Kyle Pitts is quite literally the definition of a league winner in the 4th, 5th round.
Yep, absolutely. So closing off of Kyle Pitts, we mentioned Kyle Pitts may be the best overall prospect we have seen, at least since Vernon Davis. Well, I'm going to talk about the next guy who quite possibly might be the second best tight end prospect we've seen since Vernon Davis, and that's going to be TJ Hockenson, tight end from the Detroit Lions. Currently going off the board as the tight end 6 overall on Underdog and in home leagues, 62 overall on Underdog and 52 in home leagues. So home leagues really like securing their tight ends, apparently. So we could talk about it. And we mentioned yesterday in yesterday's mistakes video to like, if you guys haven't already seen it, mistakes to avoid. We dropped 10 bombs you guys got to absolutely check out. One of the points we mentioned was vacated production. And the main misconception with vacated production is people automatically want to levy it within a franchise. They want to give it to whoever comes in because they say, oh, Kenny Galladay and Marvin Jones leaves. Well, they brought in 3 wide receivers. They got to take over the production, right? But what we talked about in yesterday's video is that typically when we see vacated production, it's mostly dispersed within players that were already accustomed in the franchise. And we're talking about a team that vacates 300 targets with the Detroit Lions. If anybody's going to get a target bump on that team, I would say it's their 3rd year top 10 selected tight end who just came off a 67 for 723 and 6 line in his 2nd year. Again, as a 2nd-year tight end, we saw last year, he's coming off a season where he was able to demand 101 targets. I would not be shocked if that was 101 targets with the vacated production left on the table for him, jumps up to 150, 120 target range. And if that's the case, I think TJ Hockenson is talented enough as a player to turn that into top 5 production. Again, I don't think he has the ceiling of a Waller, a Kittle, a Kelce personally, because those guys are absolutely special. But
he reminds me a lot of what we used to see with Zach Ertz for a lot of years. Like, that's exactly the type of player I see with him. I think he's more talented physically than Zach Ertz was, but the high target guy is what Zach Ertz was. And I think that's exactly what TJ Hockenson can be. And like you said, this guy is still a very talented player in his own right. He was the 8th overall pick in 2019 in the draft. The Lions are bringing in a system that should be comfortable using tight ends because they have Anthony Lynn, who used Hunter Henry all those years in the red zone, especially. And they had the Saints system coming in, which used Jimmy Graham back in the day, of course. And then they also used Jared Cook to some success in the past couple of years.
Yeah. And again, if you were to mention right now, 2022 entering drafts, TJ Hawkins is coming off a 130 target, 80 reception, 1,000-yard, 8 touchdown season. I fully think that's in the realm of possibilities. And if that's the case, I mean, he's going to be a near top 5 lock at that point. Again, this year, for whatever reason, I'm actually more comfortable with taking these mid-round tight ends because you get the guys like TJ Hockenson. You get the guy like the next guy we're going to mention in this list. We get the guy that we just mentioned with Kyle Pitts. It's a year where I feel comfortable with targeting these guys in the middle rounds of my draft. Whereas years past, I mean, we're talking about guys like freaking Evan Ingram. I mean, as much as we hate like what happened to OJ Howard, like OJ Howard is a prime example as well. Like it just goes to show you that you don't have to panic at the tight end position this year because you kind of got options throughout in terms of tiers where you can take these guys.
Yeah. Okay. Last year, for example, the guys that we were taking in the 4 to 6 range were Zach Ertz, Rob Gronkowski, and Evan Ingram. That was the 4 to 6 range of tight ends last year because Darren Waller was like tight end, and Mark Andrews, Darren Waller were kind of 3 and 4 interchangeably. But that's kind of what we're talking about. That's when I talked about what makes the league winning tight end video. I talked about the fact that I'm really targeting these tight ends 4, 5, and 6, Kyle Pitts, TJ Hockenson, Mark Andrews, because I think their ceiling is higher than we've seen from mid-round tight ends. And I also think a lot of these guys are a lot safer than a lot of these mid-round tight ends that we've seen. Because typically the mid-round tight ends are guys like freaking Tyler Higbee and guys in years past that are older players, not necessarily guys that are young ascending talents. And all these guys, TJ Hockenson, Kyle Pitts, Mark Andrews, are all in their, like Anderson is going into his 4th season. He's the elder statesman of this tier.
Quickly mention, where would you take TJ Hockenson on the clock right now?
So TJ Hockenson currently is not my tight end 5 like he is for you. He is my tight end 6 behind Mark Andrews. So I would take TJ Hockenson at 57 right now. So about the early 5th round is where I'm looking for him. I know on Underdog and some other drafts, this is a guy you can routinely get in the 6th, 7th round. That's why I end up with a lot of them. He does tend to go after a guy like Mark Andrews and Kyle Pitts pretty significantly, I find too, because people are scared of that Detroit Lions situation. And I heard somebody on another podcast, I can't remember what the podcast was, but basically they were saying the Detroit Lions, and I totally share the sentiment, are not going to be the worst offense in the league. I think we could both agree they're not going to be the worst offense in the league. But even if they were, the New York Jets and New York Giants last year were the 2 worst offenses in the league, and they still had 22 receiving touchdowns up for grabs in those offenses. I'm pretty sure that TJ Hockenson can carve out 6 to 7 of those 22 receiving touchdowns if that's the case in Detroit. And like I said, this offense to me is the 22nd best offense in the league, not the 32nd best offense in the league. Yep. Because I do think with their offensive line, with Jared Goff, who's a veteran quarterback, with TJ Hockenson, who's a talented player, with DeAndre Swift, who's a talented player, and maybe they can get some contributions out of some of these receivers, this should be an offense that's at least not bottom 5 in the NFL. So I think TJ Hockenson should be able to carve out a very sizable role for himself, and it should make him a pretty smash pick in drafts.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. I have him as my 55th overall player, and right behind him, 56 overall, got these guys back to back. When we talk about Mark Andrews, and the battle and conversation between Andrews and Hockenson is completely, in my opinion, volume versus efficiency. With TJ Hockenson, you should expect an absolute mammoth target share and overall target output. With Mark Andrews, you're looking at the fact that this team last year was historically low in terms of passing volume. You guys can see the graphic on the screen from Jack Miller, but the Ravens had the fewest pass attempts of any team of the last 5 seasons. New England had the 5th fewest. Below is the entire bottom 10 in team passing attempts since 2016. The average year change in year N+1, if you guys aren't familiar with that terminology, N+1 is just the year after that year. They increased by an average of 44.6 passing attempts, and 7 of those 8 teams actually increased their attempts. So when you're talking about that, and you're talking about a guy in Mark Andrews, as you guys can see, has never relied on a huge target share or a huge target output. I mean, 89 targets last year, yet what he does is he makes those targets count. He works down the field. He catches touchdowns. And if he were to ever become a 100 target, 105 target tight end, we could legitimately be talking about a guy who can post a 65 for 911 stat line. That is absolutely in the realm of possibilities when talking about Mark Andrews. I personally just see it as more of a guarantee with Hockenson, but I will say if I'm comparing straight upside, I do think that Andrews has more because we've seen him produce from a touchdown standpoint more often than we've seen TJ Hockenson.
Right. And of course the offense is night and day, right? Like this Ravens offense should be a lock top 10 unit. Obviously the Lions at best case scenario, probably about a below average unit in the league. Mark Andrews is an interesting case, but like you said, people are going to avoid him because of the lack of volume. But a couple things going for him, obviously, is the fact that Rashad Bateman is dealing with an injury right now. It sounds like Marquise Brown is also dealing with an injury. So to me, that just wheels up for Mark Andrews. Like, it sounds like he's just going to be the primary target there. And like you said, with the pass attempts, we've heard them talk about this already too, right? Like Greg Roman came out immediately and talked about the fact that they wanted to be a more balanced approach, and 480, 500 pass attempts is about what I'm expecting for the Ravens. And that doesn't sound like a lot, but that's legitimately almost 100, like 100 more pass attempts than they had last year, because they were that run heavy last year. And I think that affects everybody, really. That affects J.K. Dobbins because he's the passing down back. It also affects Mark Andrews as the primary target in that offense. And like you said, this is a guy that gets valuable targets. He's used downfield. He's used in the slot for the most part. I tweeted a stat a couple weeks ago that he had like a 1% pass blocking rate of all of his snaps. Like, it was the lowest in the NFL. This guy is never blocking. He is always running routes, which is exactly what you want out of your tight end. You don't want your tight end inline blocking. It's the reason that we want tight ends that are used in the slot and used out wide. We don't want tight ends to be in line, because when they're in line 30, 40% of the time, they're blocking instead of running routes, which is exactly what we want. So yeah, Mark Andrews, a guy that is my tight end 5. It's the reason I have him ahead of Hockenson. It's just the situational factors, the offense, the quarterback. They all kind of point to the fact that I think Mark Andrews is a safer player, because I do think there is a world where, despite getting 110, 115 targets for TJ Hockenson, he might only post a 550, 600 yard, 3 touchdown season, right? And like, that is obviously going to hurt his output, because tight ends usually go the way the touchdowns go. And Mark Andrews has a far more touchdown upside than a guy like TJ Hockenson does.
Yep, I absolutely agree. And I'm assuming because you have him ranked higher than TJ Hockenson, you would also take him in that. You mentioned TJ Hockenson at 57, probably in the early 50s range for Mark
I have
Andrews
at 55. So they are really close. But the only player I have in between them is Tyler Lockett. Don't ask me why. I just would take Tyler Lockett over TJ Hockenson. But yeah, there's a big tier drop off. Like, these tight ends that we're talking about, I actually have all of the quarterbacks higher than them. Like the second tier quarterbacks, I have all of them. Like the TJ Hockenson and Mark Andrews, not Kyle Pitts. I have Kyle Pitts quite a bit higher than both of these other guys. But yeah, I would take Josh Allen, Kyler Murray, Dak Prescott, and Lamar Jackson all over these guys, because they're also onesie positions. They also make a big difference. But we're not talking about quarterbacks right now. Let's get on to the 7th ranked tight end that we have in our rankings right now. And that is another Iowa Hawkeye, formerly with TJ Hockenson as his teammate, and Noah Fant, tight end for the Denver Broncos. Currently tight end 9 in Underdog ADP, 109th pick overall. So a guy that you're routinely getting in the 8th, 9th round. But on Home League ADP, he's the 77th pick overall, tight end 8. So overall, we do see a trend of people wanting to get their tight ends earlier on Home League ADP as opposed to Underdog drafts. Maybe it's the nature of the format. We can rely on touchdowns more, which allows us to be able to wait more at tight end, which is probably the explanation for him. But basically, when you look at Noah Fant's situation, the only question you really have is his situation, right? We don't know who the quarterback is going to be quite yet. We don't know how effective they're going to be, whoever it ends up being. He has a lot of competition for targets in his offense. We know that Courtland Sutton and Jerry Jeudy are there. And this offense is not very pass heavy, right? If you think it's pass heavy, it's not. At 53% in neutral scripts last year, were they passing the ball? That ranked 23rd in the NFL. This is a team that wants to run the ball. They traded up for a running back in the 2nd round, which probably only further points to that fact. Their offensive line is better at run blocking than they are at pass blocking. At least that's what they showed towards the end of the season last year. His ability to command targets is real, though. That's the really important thing about Noah Fant. People are going to see the target competition, Courtland Sutton and Jerry Jeudy, and assume that he's not going to get the targets. But we've already seen this guy command targets, which is the biggest indication that he can continue to do so, right? Because he ranked number 6 in the NFL among tight ends in terms of target share and ranked 6th in overall targets. And I know Courtland Sutton was dealing with an injury, but it doesn't sound like he's 100% quite yet. And he might suffer some compensation injuries as a result of that, right? He might blow his hamstring or tweak his ankle because he's dealing with that ACL reconstructive surgery. And we've seen that in the past. And I'm quoting doctors who say that, not my opinion. So his athletic profile, too, is probably the closest to Kyle Pitts as anyone in the league, right? When we're talking about Noah Fant, we're talking about a 6'5", 250-pound tight end that can run low, like high 4.4s, which is exactly what Kyle Pitts is basically, except he already has those dreaded first 2 seasons of a tight end's NFL career already out of the way. This is a guy that's going into his 3rd season. He's not a guy that is going to be acclimating to the NFL like we could see from Kyle Pitts. I don't think it's likely, but it is possible that Kyle Pitts has a down rookie season because he is a tight end. that's where you get Noah Fant, right? He's already gotten those seasons out of the way. Without an injury to Judy or Sutton, obviously, it'll be hard for Noah Fant to achieve more than a 95 to 100 target range. But even without that, we already talked about Mark Andrews being efficient on his targets. I think that Noah Fant is talented enough and athletic enough to produce on those targets. The difficult thing will be, one, how consistent is he on a week-to-week basis? And two, how many passing touchdowns will this Broncos quarterback core throw this year, right? Like I said, it's probably only going to be about 25, 24 passing touchdowns. And without Sutton and Judy getting injured, how can we really expect Noah Fant for more than 4 to 6, maybe 4 to 7 receiving touchdowns this year? So like I said with Judy, I really hope Teddy Bridgewater starts. And I talked about Judy a lot on the sophomore breakouts video, basically, because we saw him support 3 top 30 options last year at receiver with Curtis Samuel, DJ Moore, and Robbie Anderson. If Teddy Bridgewater starts, that's going to give me a lot more confidence in Noah Fant, because I think at the very least, Noah Fant can create separation because he's athletic enough, and Teddy Bridgewater can deliver him the ball accurately, which is exactly what you want to see out of Noah Fant. And he produced last year with terrible quarterback play. He was a top 10 tight end as a result of that, and I think he can be a top 10 tight end even if Sutton is on the field commanding 100 plus targets and Judy's on the field commanding 100 plus targets.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. And as you mentioned, he is the athletic profile to make up for the fact that he may not get 130, 140 targets. No, if you give this guy 95, 100 targets, he should still be a very efficient option. Again, the question mark would be obviously the overall passing output of the Broncos offense, because let's be honest, out of this whole list so far, I mean, the Broncos are clearly the worst offense, in my opinion. I mean, we're talking about...
I would say they're probably going to be a close...
Them and the Lions
are probably going to be close in terms of total points scored, but I actually have more faith in the quarterback situation in Detroit than I have in Denver.
I agree. So where would you feel comfortable taking Noah Fant?
Yeah, so I have Noah Fant currently about 15, 20 spots lower than those other tight ends that we just talked about. I have him at 76. So the wide receivers and running backs around the range that I have them are guys like Trey Sermon, his teammate Cortland Sutton, Rashad Bateman, Will Fuller, Laviska Shenault type range. That's about where I'm looking to draft Noah Fant, in that probably 7th, 8th round range of your drafts. I think if you can secure a guy that has the ceiling that Noah Fant does, obviously it might require an injury for him to achieve a top 3, top 5 ceiling, but I still think this guy is a top 5 ceiling without an injury to any of those guys, because I simply think he's that good and that talented. And the fact that he's going into his 3rd season, historically speaking, we're talking about a big jump for tight ends in the past.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with that. And I have Noah Fant currently as my 78th overall player. So we're kind of right on cue there. But we can enter the final player of this video. We don't want to keep you guys too long, currently at 37 minutes. We're going to be talking about Robert Tonyan, Big Bob Tonyan from the Green Bay Packers. We saw this guy as an absolute touchdown magnet last year. And as a result, I mean, he's currently the tight end 11 off the board, 118th overall on Underdog, tight end 9 off the board, 93rd overall in terms of multi-site ADP. And the case for Rob Tonyan is pretty simple. This guy may have been the most efficient tight end in the NFL last year. You guys can see the efficiencies on the screen. Absolutely remarkable. And when you add the fact that this guy was number 1 in production premium, number 4 in EPA, number 1 in quarterback rating when targeted, number 4 in fantasy points per route run, number 1 in fantasy points per target. I mean, this guy all over the board was absolutely dominant. I mean, the one that really stood out to me was 2.64 target separation. It was remarkable. Number 1 at the position. I mean, this goes to show that despite having limited targets, we know the bear case against him is that the fact that he only had 58 targets last year. But if you're doing that well on 58 targets, guess what? You're not going to stay at 58 targets for too long. This guy had 11 touchdowns on 58 targets, and the main thing people are going to say is, well, that has to go down, right? He can't just maintain that percentage. Yeah, but if he goes up to 75, 80 targets because he's just that good of a football player, the math is going to correct itself. I mean, he may only be an 8-9 touchdown tight end, but at the end of the day here, we're talking about a guy that has legitimate fantasy football game-breaking upside, which we just saw last year. So how is he going outside of the top 10 tight ends in Underdog? Beats me. It's probably because of the fact the market hasn't fully adjusted to the Aaron Rodgers news yet. But even if you're talking about an elite efficient tight end matched up with one of the best Hall of Fame quarterbacks I have ever seen, I mean, the sky is the absolute limit. In all honesty, we have him at 8 right now. I wouldn't be at all shocked if he ends up being that top scoring tight end of the second group on. I don't think he's going to end up outscoring the top 3 or probably Kyle Pitts as well. But if you're talking about this guy finishing as the top 5 fantasy tight end by the end of the year, I would not be shocked.
No, I totally agree. And I think the people that aren't taking Robert Tonyan are scared of what you talked about, right? They're scared of touchdown regression. And we're not here to argue the fact that his touchdowns are going down relative to how many targets he saw, but could he score 11 touchdowns again next year? He absolutely could. Why? Because we know of all quarterbacks in the NFL. If you ask me, who's a guy that trusts their guys once they figure out who their guys are at their wide receiver and tight end position, Aaron Rodgers will trust Robert Tonyan because he was good last year. And Matt LaFleur has already come out and said that we want to make him a bigger part of the offense. Remember, this is a guy that is a very good athlete for the position. His athletic profile is very good. And he was an undrafted free agent a couple years ago. And this is still a young player, too. This isn't a guy that's been in the league very long. And he's still getting acclimated. And we saw him break out already. We saw him already be a top 5 tight end on very low volume. So when you do that, it usually lets the coaching staff know that you should be more involved in the offense the next year. And I wouldn't be shocked at all if this is a 90 to 100 target tight end, which is going to be 40 to 50 targets more than he was seeing last year. And if he has 95 targets and 11 touchdowns, yes, his touchdown rate did regress, but he still scored 11 touchdowns and he was probably more effective for your fantasy team.
Yeah, and I'll be completely honest. I was under that Fugazi for the longest time in the offseason. I'm like, I'm not sure how he's going to look if Aaron Rodgers not there, yada, yada, yada. I even wrote about him in the draft guide as being a bust, which I'm absolutely going to be switching for the record if you have that draft guide. And the more I looked at it, I'm like, why the fuck am I fading this guy? Like, we talk about every year, we look for efficient guys that can take the next step. Why am I fucking fading Robert Tonyan, who is perhaps the most efficient tight end in the league? Yes, we're including Travis Kelce, we're including Darren Waller, we're including all these top guys. Robert Tonyan was the most efficient tight end in the NFL last year, and I'm adjusted. I'm learning. Again, if you enter take lock, that is the worst thing you could do as a fantasy analyst, as a fantasy football player. Be open to new information, and that is something I have fully adapted on as this offseason has gone on. So, yeah, no, I'm fully in on Robert Tonyan. I actually have him ahead of ADP now.
Yeah, I do too. He's a guy that I'm gladly taking. Where do you have him ranked exactly in terms of your overall rankings? I currently have him
89.
I have him 84, which is about 7-8 spots lower than I have Noah Fant. The guys around Robert Tonyan that I would take him over are guys like Jarvis Landry, Zach Moss, Raheem Mostert, Chase Edmonds, Corey Davis. So again, when you get to that 8th, 9th round of your drafts and you don't have a tight end yet, I guarantee you're going to be able to get a guy like Robert Tonyan. And if you're waiting at tight end, let's say, Kyle Pitts flew off the board, all these guys that we've already talked about that maybe you were interested in went higher than you thought. Robert Tonyan's a guy that people are going to buy into the lazy narrative, right? They're going to buy into the fact that he had low targets last year. They're going to buy into the fact that Aaron Rodgers was the MVP. Probably won't be the MVP again. Probably doesn't throw 45 touchdowns again this year. But like I said, if Robert Tonyan only has 8 receiving touchdowns this year, but he has 95 targets, he's going to be just as valuable as he was last year. And the reason I can say and project that forward is because this is a young player who was a part-time player last year. And in his part-time role, he shined. And anytime Rodgers gets the chance to talk about him, he does. Anytime LaFleur gets the chance to talk about him, he does, which indicate to me that he's going to be the full-time tight end. There's going to be no Jace Sternberger, no Mercedes Lewis, whoever else tight ends that they have on that offense. The guy running routes and catching the ball at tight end for the Green Bay Packers is Robert Tonyan. And with the obsession that we've seen in years past of Green Bay Packers tight ends, it's actually very shocking to me, the fact that everybody isn't high on this guy.
Yep, no, I fully agree again. So to recap the 1 to 8 in order: Travis Kelce, Darren Waller, George Kittle, Kyle Pitts, TJ Hockenson, Mark Andrews, Noah Fant, and finally Robert Tonyan. Again, if you guys have made it all the way to the end of this video, comment down below your favorite tight end to target in this range at ADP. Who are the guys that, if you're in your underdog drafts right now, you have the most exposure to? Who are the guys that you really want on your fantasy football teams in 2021 at their current cost? So anyways, hope you guys enjoyed. If you made it this far, please consider supporting us over on Underdog Fantasy. If you sign up using code FSE, you'll get a $25 match back on your first deposit of $10 or more, as well as access to both our dynasty and redraft guides currently available on our website over at thefantasystockexchange.com. So yeah, anything else you want to add before we wrap this up, Corey?
Right. And in our Dynasty and Redraft draft guides, you can see all of our rankings, Dynasty and Redraft for Superflex, one quarterback, whatever. That'll get you ready for your drafts. You can also see our picks for our top sleepers, our top busts, our top, must draft players. All of our videos that we've done relating to fantasy football will also be linked on there. So it's pretty much like a one-stop shop for everything you can find for your fantasy drafts. And we also have a ton of other information, strategy guides, how to do your own fantasy research, databases that you can use to do your own fantasy research. Everything that you could want is in that draft guide. And again, all it costs you is $10 to sign up on underdogfantasy.com. You get $25 on top of it, and you can win money with the $10 you spent on our draft guide. There is no deal out there better than that. So I encourage you to go ahead and sign up on Underdog if you want to support us and you want to win your fantasy league this year. Again, subscribe if you haven't already. Peace out, guys, and enjoy your Thursday.
Peace out.